why does local matter? So, being a news junkie myself, I tend to in, take in news from all over the place, including world news, national news, all that. And what's happened in the last 20 years, and specifically since the internet has come into being, is that local news is in no, local, not just local news, but just all types of local interest in things going on within a community. The business models have had a really hard time adapting. And so over the last 20 years, fewer and fewer local news outlets are able to stay in business because it's very hard um, to change to adapt with the different types of technology that exist that one has to adopt to in order to have a successful business in that way. And as that's happened, there's been a few things that has occurred as a result and as an unintended consequence. And one of those things is that we are taking in so much more news from a national level on our regular everyday lives. This also comes into being very connected to people from all over the country or even all over the world who are um, talking about things that are going on within their communities that aren't necessarily things that our own community might be dealing with. This becomes very confusing for people because what tends to happen is that if you don't have the perspective of being able to understand that what happens in New York City doesn't necessarily happen in the state of Texas, it can be very easy to project the problems from that community onto the one that you live in and think that the problems that are happening over here are also happening over here. And anytime that we see evidence of something that might be an isolated, solitary incident that could occur in our community, it becomes very easy to correlate the thing that's happened here with widespread problems from a different community. And I think that it also makes people very overwhelmed about how they can address the problems that the world has or that their country has, because it's very difficult on a national level to know where you can fit into the narrative and understand how to affect change. The bigger that our the bigger you go up in the hierarchy of the government, level, you go from your local city government to your local county government to your local state government to your local region government to your local federal government. The higher that you get, the more difficult it is to have a voice in what's happening. And this is why local matters a great deal. Because, number one, local government is where you can affect the most change and have the biggest voice. Ironically, it's also the place where fewer people vote. One of the things that I want to really highlight on this podcast is how much influence you can possibly have in your local government and why it's important to learn about how your local government functions and how you can get involved with having a voice in your local community. Number two, other communities are made and are are have a totally different demographic than other communities. And by demographic, I mean student population versus, maybe that's a college town that has a great deal of college students that live in it, as opposed to working professionals. Or perhaps you live in a rural community that has fewer people, but those people own a lot more parcels of land each. Perhaps you live in a community that has a larger retired population than other communities do. You also have, the demographics of cultures that come together. Obviously, you have in New York City that is a melting pot of the world's probably largest community of diverse cultures that come together. Well, you're not going to have that same type of demographic in another state in the United States. And but when you take in all these national stories and when you hear people talking about things from perhaps an office in New York City, when you read media and you read stories that are going on a national level, we also lose the perspective that that journalist that is writing this national story could be writing it from a position of a very small community in their own area. This happens a lot with places like New York and in California and Washington, D.C., where we'll get national stories that are not representative of how the country feels or sees things as a whole. And but because we are reading these stories on a regular basis, it becomes part of how we see the community around us. And the more that we get distracted by being on our phones, by being on our iPads, and being part of the virtual community, which has happened specifically during the pandemic, we become closed off to our communities, and we seem to lack a perspective of what our local community actually looks like and how it actually functions. Not the projections of other people's communities, but our actual community. We also lose the ability to come into contact with our local neighbors and how we interact with them on a regular basis. And even within a local community, you could potentially go to a church or school or be a part of some type of book club or some type of group that meets where you're still insulating yourself into a community that has like-minded voices and opinions as yourself. Well, our local neighborhoods aren't always like that, and our local communities aren't always like that. I know it isn't that way in Grand Prairie. There's a wide variety of people that you didn't choose necessarily to live next door to, but that y'all ended up owning land next door to each other. And this is a great opportunity to get to know your local neighbors, even on your street. And by doing so, you're able to keep the perspective when you know that a national news story has come out, that your community and the way that you see it and the way that it exists is not like that. It is different. So it gives us perspective of, okay, I'm going to read this news story because I want to know what's going on in other parts of the country, but we also need to know, more importantly, what's going on in our own community and in our own um, cities and local areas. This is also true for our governments because every government, every city government in the country is set up very differently. In some parts of the country, there are townships. In others, there are cities. Some people live in counties that they live in an area of unincorporated land, which means that they're not actually in a city, they're in a county. And all of these governments function differently. And the more intensely you can focus on the local of your own life and your surroundings, the better off that you're going to be. And so one of the reasons why this podcast is going to remain local is because I want my community members to focus on our local community so that we can discern when we read things, when something is an issue on a national level, when we can identify that those things might exist in our community, and also when they don't. And I think that right now that's a very important distinction to make. And it's why I want to push people to really start to hone in on their local areas around them and to really figure out what are the needs of my community? How can I fit into this discussion? And how can I affect change as a responsible voter, as a responsible citizen? And how can I educate myself on how my community actually works?